Welcome to the MSL 411, a podcast designed to equip both aspiring and experienced MSLs with the resources they need to level up their career toolkit. The heart of this podcast is to take the same industry knowledge and advice that we share with our own candidates and make it available and accessible to anyone looking for answers. So if you have questions, you've come to the right place. We're here to give you the 411. And without further ado, let's dive right in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the MSL 411 podcast. We are so excited to have a guest with us today. A longtime friend, Joe, has joined us to talk a little bit about another type of field medical role that we haven't yet talked about on the podcast, which is the health economics outcomes research role. And also real world evidence. You also work in that space. So Joe, thanks so much for joining Linda and I.
It's great to see you again, Ashley.
Yeah. So Joe, I would love if you could just give us a quick introduction, just about your background, a little bit about your title, your role, and just kind of a short summary of your experience before industry and in industry.
Okay. So I'm Joe. I'm a pharmacist by training. I come from a hospital pharmacy background, spent over a decade in hospital pharmacy with about 8 as director of pharmacy of a small rural hospital. And then I made the jump to pharma. I started at a small biotech doing field HEOR, and then moved on to a bigger company after layoffs there. So for the field HEOR role, our primary responsibility is to provide clinical information to educate population health decision makers on the value of your company's drugs, which is both clinical value and economic value. That's why both economics and outcomes are in the title. Unlike the MSL role, there's not a standardized name for the role throughout pharma, so it can also be called a medical value liaison, medical outcomes liaison. You can combine the two into medical outcomes science liaison. There's about 10 titles, but if it has value or outcomes in the name, it's probably the same thing I do.
Okay, and then can you talk a little bit about the real world evidence side as well? Because that is a part of your title, is that right?
It is. So for the field employees like myself, we don't do the real world evidence research.
Okay.
A big part of our job is population health decision makers can include physicians and pharmacists and health systems that are making the formulary decision. So a big part of our job is to take the information they're giving us, any data gaps they're talking about, and get like a basic proposal of what would meet their needs and relay that to the research HEOR team.
A lot of folks are understanding what you get to do for your daily role and thinking maybe this is what I want to do. This sounds like me. This sounds like my background, what I want to get into. Maybe you can kind of give a little bit more detail on like a day in the life in your role and what that looks like put into play at your company doing what you do in your role.
So for a day of the life in the role, I'm going to start off talking about our customer base. I said population health decision makers. What that translates to are regional payers, national payers, and health systems. Sometimes the ambulatory infusion center companies too that have multiple sites. So what we're actually talking about with them does change as a product matures. The HEOR team does what's called a pre-approval information exchange, which is where we can go talk to these payers, which is what the FDA collectively calls all those groups. We can go talk to those payers about a product that is not yet approved and talk about the clinical trial data. We can do so proactively under what they call it the PI Act, Pre-Approval Information Exchange. So early on, that's a big part of our job is going around to payers and presenting clinical data for a drug that's not yet on the market because they're planning sometimes 2 years ahead, maybe even 3. And then as the product gets approved, then the payers that we haven't talked to, our presentation changes a little bit from pre-approval information to now they call it a payer value deck or something to that effect. It can also be medical value. And that is geared towards showing the clinical data still, but also talking about some financials of the disease, showing the value of treating the disease that your drug treats. When you get even farther in the life cycle of the drug is when you start getting more real world evidence and then you're taking that to your customers. So it's engaging payers and health systems clinically, but what you're actually talking about changes throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, I think that's going to help a lot of people understand what the role looks like just in the regular day to day. I mean, a lot of the descriptions they can find online and hearing from the titles and kind of disseminating from that doesn't give all the nitty gritty detail like that. So I appreciate you sharing that information with us.
So would you say a company, when is kind of the sweet spot for a company to bring in somebody who does what you do to get that product that might be in clinical trials ready for the market? Like, when is it good from a timing standpoint? When is the right time, in your opinion, at least, to bring in people like you?
That depends a little bit on the approval pathway, but broadly speaking, after phase 2 data has read out and about a year or two before approval, to give you time to go around to all of your payer customers and give them the data so they can plan for the drug's approval, so they can plan for what's coming.
Well, we have some listeners that are people who are trying to break into industry and trying to figure out where they might fit in industry. They might have their hearts set on the MSL role, or might be just kind of open to learning what's out there. So with your background, having that pharmacy background, I think there's a lot of people who might be listening to this that might have never really considered this route and might want to, go down that path, or at least explore it and learn a little bit more about it. There are some people that I've worked with who are more on the outcome side of things, like what you do, who've come straight from pharmacy, or like maybe a PBM, into an HEOR role, who pivoted from another field role, like an MSL role. So what do you think it is about your background, coming into your first role? What do you think it was about your specific background that you think helped you to kind of land that first field HEOR role?
So the biggest thing is I focused on my specialty and tried to find a company in that area. So for me, my specialty was hospital pharmacy. So it was a small rural hospital. So I had a pretty broad knowledge base, but I really knew infusions. And I also did a lot of the pre-auths for patients for their infusions at my hospital. So I also had a decent amount of market access knowledge. And I found a startup, small biotech, that was looking for a field HEOR team, and they had a pre-op drug. My hospital was heavy on surgeries, so it was a pretty natural fit. And then on top of that, I was a for-profit hospital system that I worked for. So I was already pretty comfortable with that intersection of clinical and finance, because I had to convert anything I wanted to do clinically into dollars and cents for the C-suite.
What made you decide to go into industry after all those years in that kind of hospital setting?
So I carried this infusion drug. There was only about 45 sites in the country. It was complex. It was a 2.5-day infusion, but it was fast acting. So for some of our people, they walked out of the hospital and it changed their life in 2.5 days. But most payers didn't cover it. So it made me see how important coverage and the market access piece is to your drug succeeding. So it made me really want to move into that space where I could advocate for coverage for patients.
One of the things that I thought might be kind of helpful for the people that are tuning into this, you're at your previous company, you were more focused on a single product, whereas now you cover the whole portfolio. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So can you talk about some of the differences in supporting just one product like you did in your last position versus what you're doing now, covering multiple products that are used also in different types of settings as well?
Yeah, the biggest difference is you have to get comfortable not knowing everything about every single drug in your portfolio. Because when you have one drug, you can learn all the data in and out. You can learn the protocols, like almost word for word. But when you start to work on a full portfolio, you do need to know your clinical trial data, but you're not going to know that drug as deeply as you do with a single product. Now, when you are presenting to population health decision makers, it does tend to be a more broad knowledge base versus an individual KOL role where you tend to talk to experts in the field. So it does dovetail nicely into your audience when you're covering full portfolio to not know, like, say, subcellular mechanisms of drugs. You have to get comfortable not knowing everything. And then you also have to be able to pivot fairly quick, because if most companies are not just in one therapeutic area. So if you're talking to a health plan and they ask you about drug A in your portfolio, but then they're like, hey, what's going on with the study in drug B? You have to be ready to be able to pivot to that.
Okay. So you might go into one meeting thinking you're talking about one aspect of the portfolio, one therapeutic area, and they may just kind of spring it on you in the end.
Yes.
Oh,
So the bigger health plans, it doesn't happen as often because they do tend to have some subject matter experts that are broadly pieced out field by field. But especially with
okay.
your regional health plans, if you've got a data readout on the drug that you're not there to talk for that's about to happen, they do tend to ask about it.
And how is your approach different given the like the difference in the patient population when it's more of a widely used drug versus like a smaller patient population? It might be something like a rare disease, things like that. How does that kind of change the context of the job itself, given the patient population, would you say?
That's a great question. First, I'm going to talk about the commonality, even if you
Okay.
technically didn't ask that. One of the biggest things you can do in our job is to help payers get a grasp on population size that may be
Mhm.
eligible for treatment.
Okay.
Because they're working with every disease, they will never know the disease as well as you do.
Mhm.
So, working with population size, whether it's large or small, helping them try to predict that accurately is a big piece you can do to help out your customers, to provide value for them. For the biggest difference, you're broadly speaking, as the population size goes down, the drug gets more expensive.
Mm.
So there are different considerations for, say, a cardiology drug with millions to tens of millions of patients versus a rare disease drug that may have 100 patients in the country, and they're kind of playing out the odds to figure out if they're going to end up with one of those patients and it may be $1 million+ drug because the population's so small.
Mm.
I have talked to a lot of MSLs who are really interested in this side of things and maybe didn't know they were, but are watching this episode, hearing you talk about it and thinking this is a great role to look at, maybe starting to consider it. Do you know any colleagues, have you worked with people in the past that have come over from the MSL side to do what you do now? And do you feel that there are any benefits from coming from that medical science liaison background that would make them a stronger candidate for the type of role that you work in?
My company right now and my last one, we didn't have any MSLs on our team. We pretty broad background. My last company was almost all people with a hospital background. Here we've got a decent amount of people with an epidemiology background or research, but it's not uncommon for MSLs to convert to this role. One of the biggest things they bring to the table is that they're already medical. They're already used to answering questions reactively, which is a big part of the job. They're already used to all the compliance rules that go along with being on the medical side.
Mhm.
So, and then they can also bring expertise in a therapeutic area. For example, say you've got an oncology drug, as an MSL, it's going to be easier to get an HEOR role for an oncology company.
Right.
So you can also bring that drug expertise to the table, along with your knowledge of the compliance landscape.
There have been quite a few people that I've worked with over the years that have done that. They have kind of thought about what the logical next step is, and they were in. I think most of the time they were in smaller companies. Maybe one person I'm thinking of in a very rare area, and they did that. They did the MSL path for several years, and then they moved into the payer side of things and kind of explored that, and ended up kind of liking that a little bit more and kind of climbed the ladder in that whole world. And I was just curious if that was something that you saw commonly. And so great question, Linda. I was intrigued to kind of hear the response on that. And I think most of the people that are going to be watching this are going to be people who are in a pharmacy role now that are coming into industry. But
Mhm.
we try and kind of consider all of our audiences here. Is there any advice that you would give to somebody who knows that this is the path that they want to go down? They want to be in the outcomes world, in the payer space, who might be in pharmacy school right now. I know you went and got your MBA and got some extra education in addition to your pharmacy degree, but is that something that you would recommend to someone?
I would recommend an MBA or a Master's in Public Health, MPH. Either one is going to help you out in the field, but it's not necessarily absolutely mandatory.
Mm,
Something else you can do is build your knowledge base in market access because typically as an MSL, you don't have to worry about the reimbursement landscape. You don't have to worry about payer policy. So
mm,
building that market access knowledge base, and personally, I'd recommend getting involved with your local AMCP chapter, which is Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy.
mhm.
Every local chapter has a day of education where you get a wealth of knowledge about market access. And that's probably not only the best way to build your knowledge base, in my opinion, it's also a great way to network with similar professionals in your area for the job you aspire to do.
Mhm. You led us right into our last question, which we ask all of our guests to speak to, and create that invitation to share a little bit of wisdom from your experience. As you know, networking is so important in this industry, and we can all kind of read the posts and the blogs and watch all of the great content out there about landing an HEOR role or an MSL role. But networking is important. And so I appreciate the tip on the AMCP chapters, and some of the free events that they offer, free education events that they offer.
There is a small registration fee.
Okay. Definitely something to check out. But what I want to ask you was any networking tips or tricks or even success stories that you've had that have stuck out in your mind that you think really kind of propelled your career, or maybe even growth in your role. But any success stories or tips or tricks that you have for us?
One tip I'd have would be if you're interested in a company, look through LinkedIn, see if you have either any primary connections, which is more obvious, but secondary connections as well. Someone you know that may be able to provide a warm intro to someone in the company. That can be immensely helpful. I'm a bit of an introvert, so I find national meetings a bit overwhelming sometimes, especially when it comes to networking. The education's great, but networking can be a little overwhelming there. So regional conferences, personally, whether it's in your therapeutic area, whether it's AMCP, like I talked about, I've had all my best networking experience at regional conferences.
Since you brought it up, one more follow-up question for you. In the outcomes role, what is the conference circuit like? I'm very familiar, of course, with the MSLs, but how does that look in the outcomes world?
That's a great question. So it's going to kind of depend. Sometimes companies will have you focus on health systems, and that tends to be more your ASHP meetings, your local ASHP chapters. If you focus on payers a lot, then you're looking at AMCP and PCMA meetings, because that's where a lot of your payer discussions happen. If you do both, you're probably going to be picking one or the other out of the two, because it gets a little hectic. But then you're also probably going to go to one or two conferences in your therapeutic area a year. If you cover 8 drugs, you're clearly not going to get to all those, but typically you'll try to hit the major conference for your most recent approval for that therapeutic area.
Well, Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast with us and talking a little bit about your day today. And for those that are interested in exploring this world, giving them a head start on all things HEOR. And we really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to share the link, let your friends know, and of course, connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you want more information on today's topic, please feel free to reach out. Be sure to check back soon as we continue to explore the topics that matter most to you in medical affairs.